I've been making games since I was 11 years old. The ability to create and visualize in real time, the interactivity and the speed at which it's possible to prototype features makes it one of my favourite ways to program. In 2015, I took part in my last game jam, and after 9 years I thought it was time to change that. This is my story of Ludum Dare 55. The waiting period. It was just before 2 AM in the UK. Time was ticking, getting closer and closer as my 72 hours was about to begin. Was the draw going to be in my favour? Only time would tell. And at 2 AM, the theme was announced, and the work could begin. Over the next hour, many ideas for summoning went through my mind, but one stuck out: potion crafting. You might be wondering how that fits the theme. Well, let me explain. Let's start with the gameplay loop. The player's tasked with creating potions throughout the game. Each requested potion requires specific ingredients. These are placed in a cauldron with water, to be later scooped up with a flask and placed in a spot to submit the potion, fulfilling the order. Where do the ingredients come from, you might ask? Summoning. During my childhood, a game came out called Magicka. This game required certain key presses in order to cast the correct spell. This mechanic hasn't really been used until now, as that is how the ingredients will appear, with magical summoning key presses. Alongside me on this 72-hour journey was my brother, whose role was to create the artwork for the game. We worked on the list defining the many different ideas for art we would need, and he got to work. My first aim was to create a basic blockout of how the world would look. The game would be first person with physics-based mechanics to move the ingredients and potions around, so getting the spacing correct was important to help prototype and relay the sizing needed for the real 3D models being made in Blender. After just an hour, even with our first model, a cauldron, the layout was starting to take shape. Working on a basic character controller, I was able to navigate around the room and check all the progress so far. The next order of business was to start working on items and how the interactables were going to be moved around. Unity makes this easier with being able to assign rigid bodies to items while being powered by my custom code. The easiest way to mitigate various problems was to create a system where items can be picked up by the player's hand and shown in a suitable location. The collision of the object can be turned off in this position, which will return when the player drops the item. As you can see, this didn't always go according to plan, but after a good chunk of focus and time, and as the 4-hour mark was reached, the items were able to be picked up and then be restored to the laws of physics. The next step of this adventure was an item bin to drop items into the void to never be seen again. This feature, although fairly simple, was important, as it allowed me to test the removal of items from the world, which would be used not only for the bin, but also for when the cauldron, when mixing the ingredients, and for the sale area when handing over potions to fulfill the order. By this point, after 5 hours, it was 7 in the morning. Ludum Dare isn't kind to UK participants, starting at the dark cold hour of 2 AM. Before calling it for a quick sleep, I knew there was one more feature I needed to implement: summoning. When the player goes up to the summoning mat on the map, they can type in letters from the top left of their QWERTY keyboard. The map would accept up to 5 letters to allow a good number of variations. This edition would need a 3D interface to make it easy to see the letters entered. And with that, the first 6 hours were over. It doesn't look like much yet, but the foundations were laid for the day to come. It was time to get some rest. After a few hours, I was back up and with a mug of coffee in my hand, sat back in front of Unity, ready to get to work. And to work, I did. I began by adding new item codes to the summoning circle. This would be important for later when we wanted to implement the potion crafting. I then decided I would prevent spawning another item while a pre-existing item was blocking the way. And after consulting several different web pages, rewriting on triggers, botcasts, drawing gizmos for an hour, I gave up and moved on to water, an important ingredient in the potion making process. While waiting for the bucket to be modelled, I shrunk down and made a baby cauldron to be used in the meantime, and got to work on potion crafting. Using a list for the cauldron, ingredients could be added and then checked against predefined recipes. Oh, and I also added bat wings. If ingredients were added but no valid recipes matched, the cauldron would turn this weird brown colour. While working on the cauldron colours, the potion models came in and I decided to work through the different variations and assign materials. Finally, it was time to test out how it was going. Okay, so it still needs a little work. At this point, we'd reached later in the evening and progress was going well, because it was finally time to start working out the room for the map, so I opened up Blender and got to work. After a few hours of playing around with the dimensions, building shelves and checking the scaling, the room was ready until the art passed a bit later. As the time reached 10 PM, another sleep was fast approaching, but one more feature needed adding before I called it a night. As ominous as that sounds, this little area of the map allows players to drop off their potions to complete orders. Potions go into the hatch and the lever is pulled to submit them. Easy, see? Less than 24 hours in, it was all finally starting to take shape, so I took the chance to get some well-needed rest before a big push the next day. I opened up day 2 by replacing some of the temporary assets with new art and designing the key potions and their ingredients. Balancing the difficulty of summoning the items along with the complexity of the potions was difficult, but after some work developing different concepts, it seemed to come together. Later on, some more of the ingredient assets came in and I was able to get them all set up in game with the thistle, rat's tail, mushroom, eye of newt and dragon scale. Even the bucket was ready. Progress was good as I continued to implement the new summoning and potions until it was time to make the user interface. I extremely dislike programming UI. I don't find it particularly fun, and most of all, I find Unity's default interface system quite cumbersome. Anyway, I started off working on the order queue interface, which would pop up on the left side of the screen, allowing players to see the current potions they should be working on. Part 1 was building it in Unity, and Part 2 was programming the elements to allow dynamic creation of the orders. After pairing these up together, I found multiple issues in the code and got to work adding leading zeros and more polish. The game over screen was next on the list. Not only would it tell the user how bad they are, but also allow them to restart the game. We will come back later on adding actual graphical assets to the UI and create the main menu, but now was time to get back to my creative senses. Now I'm not a musician by any means. I've only spent thousands of pounds on different DAWs, plugins and VSTs. Good thing I found the perfect time to use them. So I got to work on my masterpiece. Simple yet elegant, repetitive but not annoying. And then binned that because I'm not a musician and I felt it just didn't fit. Instead, after another hour, I came up with something that did work. Something that, although simple, fits the theme of a potion shop, while slowly reminding you the clock is ticking on your next order. After playing around with the tempo, it was done, and I could finally return back to the world of programming. That's a lie. Instead, my creative juices were flowing and decided it was time to walk around my house, sound recording effects for the game. Now, I've never actually done Foley art for any of my previous games, so this was a new adventure for me, but the noises we needed weren't all that hard to get. Boiling, water, metal, walking, and after gathering all of this, I got back to work in Logic Pro and pretended to know I knew what I was doing, until it was time to put into Unity my masterpieces. Unfortunately, later, one fatal issue with my audio system was found. It doesn't work in WebGL, a fundamental export for game jams that allows players to play the game in the web browser instead of downloading an exe. So I then wrote my own system and implemented volume settings. The bucket you see presents a small dilemma for a game developer in me. It's the only object in game you start with and is integral to the gameplay. This means it can't go missing. If the player was able to lose the bucket somehow, it would softlock them for the next potion. So I spent a good amount of time putting myself in the shoes of a player and thought of all the ways to destroy the bucket. I later discovered there were more ways to rid the bucket of this world, but for now, if I put it in the bin or tried to sell it off, it would appear back in the room. At this stage, the gameplay loop was well established, and while I waited for new art to come through, I thought I would start to add polish to the pre-existing features in the scene. Although I have experience with the Unity particle system, I wouldn't say I was an expert, so I got to work reminding myself of the basics by adding bubbles to the cauldron in the middle of the room, while also trying to destroy the bucket. Later on, I would go on to add particles to the bucket spawning, the ingredient summoning, and the void bin before calling it a night. In the morning, it was time to say goodbye to that cuboid that represented the summoning circle and actually replace it with the newly created art. Made up of the engraved circle and candles, it would need some lighting and smoke to really bring the best out of it. Some more sound effects were needed at this stage, but ones I couldn't do myself, mainly for the summoning, so I went back to Logic and brushed the dust off my overpriced VSTs. It was then time to get rid of the temporary building I built earlier in the jam and replace it with the nicer and actually well made asset made by my brother. Everything was moved and replaced to fit into this new room, and it looked so much better. More particles were added to the fire, and when successful potions were created in the cauldron. Signs placed around the room to guide players, large scrolls with summoning and crafting information. I even recorded some new sounds. The game was finally starting to look good. We even decided on a name, and after continuing to add in final art and create an ode to ourselves in the level, everything was done. At least, so I thought. Something was wrong. The game played great and ran well. We even added instructions on how to play, but something stood out from our first playtest. The lighting was appalling. All this art and effort, and it just didn't look good. Lighting is one of those things that can vastly change the look of a scene in a game. The thing is, I didn't know what I was doing. While generating the light maps, things started to go from bad to worse. Time was ticking. I only had a few hours to submit our final game build. Luckily, through the darkness, I found a checkbox. I needed to tick it on every model, but it would solve all my problems. Generate light map UVs, and within a few minutes, on the next light map generation, my mood was about to brighten. And there we are. The final game was ready. All there was left to do was build and submit. With just over an hour to go in the Ludum Dare tradition, I wrote about our accomplishment. Mixology Madness was ready for voting. Game jams are beautiful. Yes, stress obviously comes with it, but that's all part of it. Working under pressure and challenging yourself, brushing up on old skills and learning new ones. Game development is art, and jams are the purest form of it. I'm proud of what my brother and I accomplished in 72 hours. We built this together and focused on our strengths while working on our weaknesses. If you are not sure, give it a go. You never know what you're going to achieve, even if it's just fun with friends or family along the way.